Doctor left his wife with nothing because she refused to have an abortion. Years later, he sees her again on TV. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as Dr. Thomas Bennett strolled down the pristine hospital hallway. His starched white coat bore his name embroidered in gold, a badge of his years of dedication to becoming one of the most respected surgeons in the region. For Thomas, his career was everything, the only thing, and he ensured nothing and no one jeopardized it. Not even Sarah. Sarah had been his anchor during med school, working extra shifts as a nurse to pay their bills while he chased his ambitions. Her optimism had been the perfect antidote to his clinical pragmatism, a delicate balance that had once made them a strong team. But when Sarah told him she was pregnant, everything changed. "It's just not the right time," Thomas had said one night, his voice sharp but restrained. He paced their small apartment, unable to meet her eyes. "We're barely managing as it is. Another responsibility could ruin everything we've worked for." Sarah, sitting on the edge of their worn-out sofa, held her stomach protectively. Her voice wavered but held an edge of defiance. "It's not just my responsibility. This is our child, Thomas." His response had been ice-cold. "I'm not ready, Sarah. And if you're going to keep this baby, you'll have to do it without me." The ultimatum shattered their world. Thomas walked out, leaving Sarah alone to face the uncertainty ahead. He rationalized his decision as self-preservation, convinced that Sarah would see reason and terminate the pregnancy. But days turned into weeks, and then months. His calls to check if she had changed her mind went unanswered, and eventually, she disappeared from his life. Without the distraction of a family, Thomas dedicated himself entirely to his work. He became the youngest head surgeon in the hospital's history, known for his cutting-edge techniques and relentless drive. His colleagues admired him. His superiors respected him. But behind the accolades and surgical triumphs, a gnawing emptiness lingered. He buried it under long hours in the OR and a string of superficial relationships. Thomas often told himself that his success justified the sacrifice. "I'm saving lives," he'd think, as though the mantra absolved him of abandoning the one life he had a hand in creating. He never spoke of Sarah or the child. For him, they were a chapter long closed, a necessary casualty on his road to greatness. It was a routine Monday morning when Thomas's neatly ordered world began to crack. Between surgeries, he grabbed a quick coffee in the hospital lounge. A news segment playing on the television caught his attention. The anchor was speaking about a groundbreaking surgical innovation that had been making waves in the medical community. The camera cut to a packed conference room, where a woman in her late 30s, dressed in scrubs, stood at the podium. Her confident voice filled the room as she described a revolutionary procedure for organ regeneration. Thomas froze. The woman on the screen was unmistakable, Sarah. His coffee slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Colleagues turned to look, startled by the rare show of emotion from the usually composed Dr. Bennett. But Thomas didn't care. He was transfixed by the image of the woman he had left behind, now standing at the forefront of a medical breakthrough that could change lives. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. One of the nurses answered enthusiastically. "That's Dr. Sarah Bennett. She's been making headlines for her work in regenerative medicine. She's presenting at the International Medical Summit next week. Isn't she incredible?" Thomas's heart sank. Sarah had not only survived without him, she had thrived. But there was something else gnawing at him. The name Bennett suggested she hadn't remarried. Why would she keep his last name? And what had she been through to rise to such prominence? For days, Thomas couldn't focus. The sight of Sarah had awakened memories he thought he had buried. Her laughter, her determination, the way she always believed in him even when he doubted himself. He began obsessively researching her career, discovering article after article detailing her rise in the medical world. She had started small, volunteering at a community clinic while pursuing advanced studies. Somehow, she managed to juggle motherhood, work, and education, eventually earning a reputation as a visionary in her field. Interviews painted a picture of resilience and determination, but Thomas noticed she never mentioned a partner or father for her child. Then he stumbled upon a photo that shook him to his core. It was a candid shot of Sarah outside a hospital, holding hands with a young boy. The boy, no older than 12, had Thomas's sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes. There was no denying it, the child was his son. Unable to contain his curiosity or his guilt, Thomas decided to attend the International Medical Summit where Sarah would be speaking. He convinced himself it was to learn more about her innovation, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He needed answers. The day of the summit, Thomas sat in the audience, his hands clammy with anticipation. When Sarah took the stage, she commanded the room with the confidence of someone who had earned her place through sheer grit. She spoke passionately about her work, but it was her closing remarks that left the audience, and Thomas, stunned. "I dedicate this achievement to my son, Ethan, who gave me the strength to persevere when life seemed impossible. He taught me the true meaning of resilience, and everything I do is to build a better future for him." The crowd erupted into applause, but Thomas felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Her words were a mirror reflecting everything he had turned his back on. As Sarah left the stage, she glanced toward the audience, and her eyes locked with his. Thomas froze as Sarah's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned away, her expression unreadable. He wanted to call out to her to say something, but the weight of the years and his own choices pressed heavily on him. He remained seated as the crowd began to disperse, each clap of applause ringing in his ears like a reminder of what he had abandoned. He stayed until the auditorium emptied. Alone in the vast room, he stared at the stage where Sarah had stood, her words replaying in his mind. She had built a life without him, a better life than he ever imagined for her. And Ethan, his son, a child he had convinced himself wasn't his responsibility, now stood as the reason for Sarah's incredible success. Thomas's thoughts swirled as he returned to his hotel. That night, sleep eluded him. Questions haunted him. Questions he had no right to ask but desperately wanted answers to. What kind of life had Sarah and Ethan endured after he left? How had she managed to rise from the ashes of their shattered relationship to become the woman he had seen on stage? And most of all, would she ever forgive him? The next morning, he found himself pacing the hotel room, unable to suppress the urge to confront her. Checking the summit schedule, he saw that Sarah had a networking session later in the afternoon. It was his chance to speak with her, though the idea of facing her after so many years left his stomach in knots. When he arrived at the session, the room was buzzing with excitement. Attendees crowded around Sarah, who smiled graciously as she answered their questions. Thomas lingered on the outskirts, his nerves battling his determination. Finally, as the crowd began to thin, he stepped forward. "Sarah," he said, his voice wavering slightly. She turned toward him, her expression cool but not unkind. "Thomas," she replied evenly, as though she had been expecting him. He faltered, searching for the right words. "I saw your presentation yesterday. It was incredible." "Thank you," she said, her tone polite but distant. "I've worked hard to get here." "I can see that," he said, the weight of his guilt making his voice quieter. "You've achieved so much. And yet, you're wondering why I'm still using your last name," she said, cutting straight to the point. "It wasn't for you, Thomas. It was for Ethan. He deserved to know where he came from, even if you weren't there." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. "I deserve that." "Do you?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "Do you have any idea what it was like raising a child alone while working and studying? Do you know how many nights I wondered if I'd made the wrong choice by keeping him? But every time I looked at him, I knew he was worth it. And now he's worth everything." "I want to meet him," Thomas said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to make demands, Thomas. You lost that right the day you walked out on us. Ethan doesn't even know you exist, and honestly, I don't think he needs to. Thomas's chest tightened. Please, Sarah. I just want a chance to explain myself. Her laughter was bitter, a sharp contrast to the warmth he remembered. Explain yourself. To me or to him. Because I can promise you he won't care about your excuses. I protected him from the pain you caused, and I'm not about to let you disrupt his life now. Before he could respond, a young voice called out from the doorway. Mom. Thomas turned, his breath catching as he saw Ethan standing there, holding a folder. The boy was tall for his age, with the same determined look in his eyes that Sarah had once had. For a moment, Thomas could see a younger version of himself in the boy's features. Who's this? Ethan asked, looking between his mother and Thomas. Sarah hesitated for a split second before stepping closer to her son. This is Dr. Thomas Bennett, she said carefully. He's an old colleague of mine. Ethan's face lit up with curiosity. You're the Thomas Bennett, the surgeon who developed the Bennett protocol for heart transplants. I read about your work in one of Mom's medical journals. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. Yes, that's me. Cool, Ethan said, his tone casual but respectful. Mom said you were one of the best surgeons out there. Sarah's expression hardened slightly, but she said nothing. Ethan handed her the folder he was holding. Here's the paperwork you needed, Mom. I'll wait outside. As Ethan left the room, Thomas turned to Sarah, his voice barely above a whisper. He knows who I am. Only professionally, Sarah said, her eyes blazing. He knows your name because I refuse to let my personal feelings get in the way of teaching him about medicine. But he has no idea you're his father, and I intend to keep it that way. Sarah, please, Thomas said, his voice breaking. I want to make things right. She shook her head, her voice laced with pain and anger. You don't get to rewrite the past, Thomas. You made your choice and so did I. The difference is, I chose to stay and fight for him. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Thomas alone with the crushing weight of his regret. Thomas left the networking session feeling hollow, his chest tight with a pain he hadn't felt in years. The image of Ethan's face, his face, kept replaying in his mind. He saw the boy's curiosity, his quiet confidence, and even the traces of admiration when Ethan spoke of his medical work. It was a connection Thomas hadn't earned, and the realization gutted him. 4 days, he remained in the city, unable to leave. Something about seeing Sarah and Ethan had awoken a longing he didn't know he still had, a need for redemption or perhaps reconciliation. He didn't want to just walk away this time, not after seeing what his absence had cost them. But the more he thought about it, the more he doubted he deserved any forgiveness. Still, he had to try. The following week, Thomas attended another event where Sarah was scheduled to speak, though this time he stayed in the background. After her session ended, he approached her as she was packing up her things. Sarah, he began, his voice steady but tentative. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I need you to hear me out. Not for me, but for Ethan. She sighed, her hands stilling on the edge of her briefcase. You've already said your piece, Thomas. There's nothing more to discuss. I abandoned you, he said bluntly. I abandoned both of you, and it was the worst decision of my life. I convinced myself it was the right thing to do, but the truth is, I was selfish. I wasn't ready to be a father, and I didn't think I could handle the responsibility. But I see now that my cowardice made things harder for you, and for him. Her expression softened, but only slightly. You're right, it did. And I had to pick up the pieces on my own. So what now, Thomas? You think an apology will change what happened? No, he admitted. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to do something for him. If there's a way I can help, in any way, please let me. Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Help him how? He doesn't need your money, and he certainly doesn't need your pity. I don't want to give him either, Thomas said firmly. I just want to know him, to be a part of his life. If he'll let me. She shook her head. You don't understand, Thomas. You can't just walk back into someone's life after leaving them for over a decade. You missed his first steps, his first words, his first day of school. You missed everything that made him who he is. How do you expect to be a part of his life now? Thomas's shoulders sagged. He didn't have an answer for her, and they both knew it. But before Sarah could leave, she added, "There's one thing you could do. But it's not for him, it's for you." He looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "What is it?" "Take a long, hard look at yourself and figure out why you're doing this," she said quietly. "If it's guilt, then you're not helping anyone. But if you truly want to make amends, then prove it. Not to me but to him. Show him you've changed, even if it takes years." Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I will." Weeks turned into months as Thomas threw himself into self-reflection and efforts to repair the damage he had caused. He began volunteering at clinics in underprivileged communities, working with single parents and their children. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Slowly, he began to understand the challenges Sarah must have faced raising Ethan alone, and the strength it took to succeed despite the odds. He sent letters to Sarah every few weeks, updating her on his efforts and asking for a chance to meet Ethan. She never responded, but he continued writing, knowing it was the only way to show her he was serious. One day, nearly a year after their encounter, Thomas received a reply. It was a short note, written in Sarah's precise handwriting. "Ethan's science fair is next Saturday at Riverside High. If you want to meet him, this is your chance. Don't waste it." Thomas's heart pounded as he read the words. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When the day arrived, Thomas stood nervously in the crowded school gymnasium, watching as students showcased their projects. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Ethan, who was standing beside a large display board titled "Regenerative Medicine: The Future of Healing." Thomas approached slowly, his hands trembling. "Hi, Ethan," he said, his voice barely audible. Ethan turned, his face lighting up with recognition. "Dr. Bennett, what are you doing here?" "I came to see your project," Thomas replied, his smile shaky but genuine. "Your mother told me about it. She said it was impressive." Ethan beamed, clearly proud of his work. "Thanks. It's about how we can use stem cells to repair damaged organs. Mom helped me with some of the research." "She must be very proud of you," Thomas said softly. "She is," Ethan replied, then hesitated. "But why are you really here? You're not just a surgeon, are you?" Thomas's breath caught. "What makes you say that?" Ethan shrugged. "Mom always gets this weird look whenever I talk about you. Like there's something she's not telling me." Thomas glanced over at Sarah, who stood a few feet away, watching them with a mixture of caution and hope. He turned back to Ethan, his voice steady. "I'm here because I want to get to know you, Ethan. And because there's something I need to tell you." Ethan tilted his head, curious. "What is it?" Thomas hesitated, then said, "I'm not just a surgeon. I'm also your father." Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Thomas braced himself for rejection, but instead, Ethan simply stared at him, processing the revelation. Finally, the boy said, "You left us, didn't you?" "Yes," Thomas admitted, his voice breaking. "And it's the biggest mistake I've ever made. I can't change the past, but I want to be here for you now, if you'll let me." Ethan studied him for a long moment, then glanced over at Sarah, who gave him a small nod. Turning back to Thomas, Ethan said, "I don't know if I can forgive you, but maybe we can start with today." Tears filled Thomas's eyes as he nodded. "I'd like that." As the science fair continued around them, Thomas realized it wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something he never thought he'd have, a second chance. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.